Good morning and welcome to Across the Arts. I am your host, Patrick D. McCoy, and thank you so much for tuning in to this very important installment of the Maestro series. I'm extremely delighted to welcome world-renowned composer and conductor John Rutter to the broadcast this morning. Before we get into our chat together today, I do want to take the time to read a bit of Dr. Rutter's biography. John Rutter was born in London and studied music at Clare College, Cambridge. He first came to notice as a composer during his student years. Much of his early work consisted of church music and other choral pieces, including Christmas carols. From 1975 to 79, he was director of music at his alma mater, Clare College, and directed the college chapel choir in various recordings and broadcasts. Since 1979, he has divided his time between composition and conducting. Today, his compositions, including such concert-length works as Requiem, Magnificat, Mass of the Children, The Gift of Life, and Visions, are performed around the world. His music has featured in a number of British royal occasions, including the two most recent royal weddings. He edits the Oxford Choral Classic series, and with Sir David Willcocks co-edited 4 volumes of carols for choirs. In 1983, he formed his own choir, the Cambridge Singers, with whom he has made numerous recordings, and he appears regularly in several countries as guest conductor and choral ambassador. He holds a Lambeth Doctorate in Music, and in 2007 was awarded a CBE for services to music. Now, I could go on and on and on about Dr. Rutter's accolades, but at this time, I would like for you to give a warm virtual welcome to distinguished composer and conductor, John Rutter. Good morning, good afternoon, Dr. Rutter.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. And oh my goodness, those dates do sound so long ago.
I am so excited, and I just want to speak to the YouTube and the Facebook community. I hope you're sharing this wonderful interview, and I'm sure you can just feel the excitement that I have, because this is truly an honor. So let's jump right in. I want to talk to you, Dr. Rutter, about the fact that, of course, as you know, we're all sitting in our homes behind these computers and the pandemic. So first of all, I want to talk more personally about you. How are you doing during this time, and how have you adjusted?
Well, do you know, I don't think I had as much adjustment to do as the great majority of musicians, because as a composer, I work in isolation anyway. All my life, when I am writing, I can't bear to have anybody around. I don't like to be overheard if I'm maybe doodling at the piano, or if I'm attempting to sing, or if I'm groaning and grunting and cursing when I can't get one little bit of it right. So it is best I work in solitude, all alone. Now, of course, as a conductor, it's a very different story, because it's like I've had my right arm cut off. I have normally a busy schedule traveling. I think I visited 10 or 12 countries in 2019, the last year when you could. And of course, I visited in 2020 nil countries. I stayed put here. It has been an opportunity to compose and to do quite a lot of what I call painting the garage, you know, the sort of jobs you never quite get around to in normal times. And in fact, this very day, I have been tidying my music library, which has been quite an epic task that is 2 or 3 years overdue. There's scores and books and orchestra parts have been piling up in my little library room, and I'm finally getting them into something like good order. So I'm actually, in a way, one of the fortunate ones, because I can carry on. I have been able to carry on, but with a heart that is just bleeding for my performing colleagues, those who play in orchestras, those who sing in choirs, those who direct choirs, those who listen to concerts and who enjoy a church service with a real choir there. All of those people are in the desert right now, and we are just waiting for that oasis. Water, fresh spring water, and then we will all be fully alive once more. So it's been a tough time for many, but I think musicians are adaptable people, that we deal with what is. We are practical, we get on with our work, and I have been amazed at the inventive ways that so many musicians have found to continue making music and connecting with other musicians at this unprecedented time. There has never been anything like it.
It's so true, because I never imagined I would be connecting with you in this way. Now, when I was preparing for this interview, I saw that back in 2018, you had your Florence debut conducting your very own Requiem. So did you imagine or fathom the fact that just a few years later, we would be in the midst of a global pandemic?
Oh, no. I haven't got second sight. I mean, all of us have got wonderful hindsight. When you compose, you never know what will happen to every composition. It's like your children. If you have children, they go out into the world and they may go all sorts of different places. Some of them may thrive and prosper. Some may not do so well. And sometimes those are the ones you love the most, in a sense. But no, I had no idea what was going to happen to my Requiem that you've mentioned. I wrote it in memory of my late father, who died in 1983. And I just wanted to write something that I hoped he might have enjoyed if he had been there in the front row listening to it. And I thought, well, okay, that's that. It'll probably only get one performance. And all the others have been a blessing and a bonus. The subject matter of a Requiem is, of course, something that connects us all. And sadly, in this pandemic, it has been a relevant subject for far too many people. And it ain't over yet. But there is consolation to be found in the great words of Scripture. And of course, in the music that composers have written. I mean, people remarked of the English, but I think it's not just true of the English. Oh gosh, they do love their requiems, because we've got Mozart, we've got Berlioz, we've got Verdi, we've got Brahms, we've got Fauré, we've got Duruflé. The list goes on. And so, it's one of those things, because the subject matter sooner or later affects all of us. And in the pandemic has been affecting many of us. I think it has a place in dealing with the appointment that I'm afraid in the end we all have to keep.
That's exactly right. I want to go back, just talking a little bit more in depth about the pandemic, because I came across an interview that was posted by Oxford, and you were talking about your thoughts on choirs and this whole idea of getting back together. And I'm sure there in the UK and the spaces that you have performed with choirs and the cathedrals and things like that, if I'm not mistaken, the gist of the interview was talking about the relation of space and choirs and the instruments and so forth. Could you maybe share with those who may be unfamiliar with what I mean in terms of the pandemic, what your thoughts are about the choirs in space and just getting back together in the church context?
Well, we are blessed in the United Kingdom with a lot of very large old churches and cathedrals with lofty ceilings where your possibly infectious droplets can disperse harmlessly amidst the medieval carvings. And so the rules are being relaxed somewhat to permit choirs to stand apart, but in a large interior space. And that, of course, is great in some ways, because every singer needs their personal space. And when you normally sing in a choir, you are right shoulder to shoulder next to whoever you are next to. And something of your nature as a singer can blossom maybe rather more if you have got the obligatory 2 meters between you. And in fact, I would say it's improved the singing of some of our choirs as a kind of accidental byproduct of this situation, because you have to listen harder, and yet you can maybe let your voice out a little more freely. I'm not suggesting that we should do that forevermore. And of course, with a large choir, it's not possible. I mean, if you've got 200 singers, they pretty much have to be next to one another, even in a very large space. But it is lovely to contemplate those large spaces and to sing in them in a spaced out way. I mean, many people will have witnessed the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh just a couple of weeks ago in the spacious chapel of St. George's, Windsor. Now, that building, interior-wise, is divided into 2 halves. The organ is halfway down the nave, and from the organ to the altar, there are pews, and that's where you saw those 30 mourners, members of the royal family, seated. But westwards of the organ, there are chairs you can clear away, which they did, and you then have a very large empty space, which incidentally looks fabulous. I mean, it's the most beautiful stonework. And we had just 4 singers filling that mighty space. There were 3 regular members of the choir. It's a choir of boys and men normally, and the ruling came down from the powers on high that no, you can't have the choir at the service, maybe because it would set a bad example, or perhaps because of possible infection risk, who knows. So there were 3 of the gentlemen of the choir, but none of the boy choristers were allowed to take part. And what we got was one very soberly black-clad lady who's actually a choir wife. Her husband sings in the choir, and she lives right there in the close, and that beautiful horseshoe cloister that you see as you look down the steps from the west door. And at very short notice, she was drafted in to form a quartet. And several of my friends commented when they heard, just maybe the day before, only 4 singers. They thought, oh my goodness, they're not going to fill the space. And do you know, everybody said, my gosh, they did. Spaced out as they were, and they're all 4 very accomplished singers. It worked. And so we can experiment with numbers and with spacing in choirs. I think we've had to do that during this pandemic, but some of the lessons we've learned, I think, will stay. And so you have to look on the positive side of every experience. And everybody seemed to agree that there was something very moving about how, in a way, everyone was spaced out. You know, maybe the Queen sitting all on her own, thinking her own thoughts, grieving in her own private way, and the 4 singers just apart in that half circle and singing with each other, but in a way not to each other. They were just singing to that big, glorious space, and of course articulating the words and the music of that occasion, which sometimes a funeral can seem almost too cheerful, you know. Lots of people, oh, hey, we're all going to have a drink afterwards. And that's fine, it's good to celebrate somebody's life. But at the same time, there's a somber element to loss and bereavement, and I thought that was captured exceptionally well. And I can even say I'm not sure it would have had that same atmosphere if we had had the full choir. So, you know, that's one of the things about space and the pandemic that has affected choral singing. And when we all get back together, that we may find that we're asked to stand in some strange places that we're not accustomed to. Maybe that'll be good.
Dr. Rutter, I'm so glad that you explained the configuration of the Quartet of Singers, because there was quite a discussion on social media because a couple of people wondered, well, why are the three men vested, but the female soprano was not? So I'm glad that you.
The very simple answer to that, she wouldn't have been allowed to, because, the choir of boys and men are the choir of a royal foundation, okay? And only they in Britain are allowed to wear those red cassocks beneath their white surplices, all right? And so if we had had the boys, they would have been vested, but she is not a member of that royal choir. And so she would not be permitted. I mean, the vergers would have thrown her out at the door if she had appeared in vestments to which she was not entitled. She's very much a member. I mean, she sung for me in the Cambridge Singers, Miriam Allen. She's a great singer. But she is a member of the St. George's family. Everybody knows her. Those guys all probably have privately sung with her on different occasions, but not in the choir of St. George's. And Her Majesty the Queen is somebody who's very insistent on correct protocol. And she has actually commented on other choirs that should not be wearing red cassocks because they're not Royal Foundation choirs. She has remarked afterwards to the clergy, they shouldn't be wearing those. And so she is known to be insistent on doing these things correctly according to the protocol and precedent. Westminster Abbey Choir can wear red cassocks. They're another Royal Foundation, you see. And King's College, Cambridge was founded by King Henry VI, okay? And they are a royal foundation, so they wear red cassocks. However, other choirs that are not royal they're not supposed to do that. So I've let you into a secret, and I hope that actually solves the problem or the question, answers the question for those people who were wondering about it. But she was dignified and proper in a black dress. I may say, very graciously consented to be part of this quartet at very short notice indeed. And so it was all done correctly according to the royal procedure. So now you know.
Thank you. So I want to kind of continue this because I do a lot of reading, and of course I'm prepared for the interview. I loved your breakdown of the music featured at the service. I enjoyed reading it so much. But one of the pieces that really struck me was the setting of the Psalm 104 by William Lovelady. I was just so moved by that piece, and I just really liked how you, as a composer and a conductor yourself, you were able to really share in that space about how you felt about the music. It was also beautifully done, and the quartet was wonderful.
Well, William Lovelady, to be honest with you, was not a name that I knew, but he composed a cantata based around the natural world, you know, birds and beasts and flowers and trees and all of that kind of thing, which was premiered on the Duke of Edinburgh's 80th birthday, which is pretty amazing when you think that was almost 20 years before his death. But the Duke took a fancy to the piece. It was too long to perform in the context of a funeral, but he did say, I would like that at my funeral. That was one of the pieces he specially requested. It had an accompaniment for string orchestra, which James Vivian, the director of music at St. George's, adapted for organ. And he abridged it to be of a suitable length, and that worked well. And actually, the voice parts being rather soloistic, almost like in an opera, you might say, it worked better really for solo quartet than it would have worked for choir. And it was one of those pieces that the composer had given himself a challenge with, because the bass line repeats over and over and over. That's called ground bass technique, or a passacaglia is another word for it, or chaconne, much the same thing. And one of our great English composers, Henry Purcell, specialized in them. And one of his best beloved compositions is Dido's Lament from the opera Dido and Aeneas that he wrote in 1689. And what was so lovely was that this piece, the Psalm 104 setting, referred back to a technique from the 17th century. So in a way, in a historic building like St. George's, on an occasion where you're looking back into the past, aren't you? You're not really looking forward. In a sense, a funeral is reflective and looking backwards. There were so many references back. And another one that I bet hardly anyone knows is that the Russian Kontakion of the departed, give rest, O Christ. Okay, now, the manuscript of that was very probably smuggled into England, or rather into Scotland, and I'll tell you why in a minute, in a fishing boat around the time of the Russian Revolution, because Russian liturgical music was unknown in the West. And after the revolution, of course, it was banned in Soviet Russia, but there were people who valued it. And the fishing fleets actually, even after the revolution, they continued to ply their trade between the Russian seaports and Scotland, okay? And we think that that is how Russian liturgical music first reached us in Britain, smuggled on fishing boats and published first by the noted Scottish publisher of Bailey and Ferguson, because I did a little research into this and I said, well, how is it that this Scottish publisher was publishing Russian music in the 1920s? And somebody said, well, it was all to do with the fishing trade. So there you go. It's just rather lovely to think that this piece of Russian liturgical music, which of course recalled the Duke of Edinburgh's background in the church he was born in, the Orthodox Church, that was his church by birth, that piece could never have been there probably but for a fisherman smuggling it in amongst the herring and the trout and the cod on a fishing boat, and handing it over rather secretly to somebody evading the customs men who might have been suspicious, and then getting it to the publisher. And so that was just the story of one of the pieces. There are stories to all of them, but the music was put together beautifully. And you will know as a church musician that you don't just stick down a list of pieces, for a service. You plan them, and you want it to all feel like it's come from the same event. It's all part of one great arc, that goes from the beginning through to the end. And that I thought was very well achieved, but many people, of course, wouldn't be consciously aware of that. But it's just nice to have it pointed out that that's how it works so well. So I was actually quite sincerely full of admiration for how well it was put together and how interesting the choices of music were. But not one word was said about the music in I'm sorry to say, in our UK television networks. That, of course, the pictures will have been the same wherever you saw them in the world, but the commentary and the analysis and discussion afterwards, every TV station had its own. And I understand in the States, some of those who talked about the funeral after it was over did actually mention the music. But here in Britain, I'm sorry to say, there was not one word. We had plenty about the body language of William and Harry, and, did they speak to each other, did they not, et cetera, where it's all speculation, because who really knows, but you can talk about it plenty. And the music, which formed part of what I thought was a very moving liturgy, it's all about music playing its part. The music is not the main thing. It's part of something greater. And I thought this perhaps could have been appreciated just a little bit by the people who commented about it. And so I have to admit, I did write that blog just thinking, well, it would just be nice to point out some of the information that was not there. But I didn't mention the story about the fishing boat because I'd run out of words.
Well, Dr. Rutter, I want to turn my attention now to your glorious music on a more of a festive note. I think one of the first compositions of yours that I was exposed to was the Te Deum. And so what I would like to do is just play an excerpt, of course, at the composer's permission of the Te Deum. And then I would like for you to just maybe talk a little bit about this work. You all give me just a second here. And
this goes back to 1988, if I remember the year correctly.
okay. You know, these virtual conversations are quite something when you're trying to get things to happen, but I think we got it now. Oh, there we go. So this is just an excerpt of Dr. Rutter's Te Deum. So here we go. And I think we'll be able to do that. And such a festive work. So the thing that I really like is how you have these seraphic voices, especially the upper voices, in tandem with the majestic maestoso nature of the brass. So I love that combination. So you started out talking about the Te Deum, but what really inspired all of that festive nature into that? I know that text, we praise thee, oh God.
Well, you know, Sir Laurence Olivier, the great actor, remarked of his composer friend, Sir William Walton, whose music I'm a great admirer of. He said, he's not afraid of the brass. And I hope I'm not afraid of the brass, because of course they lend a festive and magnificent touch to any music, particularly of course if you're in a cathedral acoustic. And it just is something. One of the highlights of my life, I have to say, was conducting the Verdi Requiem in Carnegie Hall in New York with all the additional brass up in the balcony. And I thought it was like the last trumpet sounding. It was, the apocalypse. I thought, my goodness me, here in Carnegie Hall. So yes, I love brass. I love all instruments, actually. And when they're combined with voices, of course, you can have a ball. Though I must tell you, I originally wrote that Te Deum just for organ accompaniment with choir, but it was the organ of Canterbury Cathedral, which does have some quite impressive trumpet stops on it. So that was, you might say, the original black and white sketch, but I was just longing to score it up for full orchestra, for symphony orchestra, which is what I did on the recording that you've just heard now. a sad memory because the organist at that first performance, which was a celebration occasion, it was the centenary of our Guild of Church Musicians in Britain, which is somewhat like the American AGO. And they were celebrating 100 years. They said, we'll be in Canterbury Cathedral. And the organist was somebody who was a dear friend of mine, John Scott, who, of course, moved to the United States to become organist, choir director of St. Thomas's Church in Fifth Avenue, but died well before his time. Again, I would say overwork probably had something to do with it. He pushed himself hard because he kept his organ playing up to recital standard. He had just toured Europe giving organ recitals, returned home on a long flight, and unfortunately died of a sudden heart attack just within a day or two of his return. But he played for me on many occasions, including that one, and he always did a fabulous job. One of those colleagues that you always think back on and say, oh gosh, well, he was something special, she was something special. And so that was the Te Deum. Happy associations, particularly as I also remember John, who played on the first occasion of that celebration service with a put together choir. I was told, look, they're only going to have maybe 20 minutes to rehearse the piece before the service, so don't make the voice parts too difficult. And I hope I didn't. The organ part's the difficult part.
Yes, I want to continue talking about the music that you have composed, especially for choirs, because I know as a church musician myself, and I can speak for all of the church musicians in particular who are listening, your music is so wonderfully accessible to the church choir. And I would say that, of course, I can name all of the favorites, you know, the Lord Bless You, Keep You, Again, a Blessing. But the one that I first was exposed to beyond the Te Deum was definitely For the Beauty of the Earth. So the thing that I really liked was in this pandemic season, you did a twist on this with these piano transcriptions performed by Wayne Marshall. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that project, and then I'm going to play a little snippet for the audience. So let me go ahead and do this. There we go. Ah, that was so beautiful. And I must recognize the talented conductor, organist, you name it, Wayne Marshall. He's been a gift to us in this pandemic with all of his organ concerts. So thank you, Wayne Marshall. Dr. Rutter, could you maybe talk a little bit about your association with Wayne Marshall and how this collaboration came about?
Well, we go a long way back. The reason for making piano transcriptions of some of my choral pieces was that it was one of those painting the garage jobs which I had never gotten around to in all the years. Now and again, people come up to me and say, look, I love to play the piano at home, and I'd like to be able to play some of your choral pieces, but I don't read a choral score, and I haven't got a choir in my living room. And so could you maybe do some solo piano versions of some of your shorter pieces? And I finally thought in the pandemic, I'll do it. That was my first thought. My second thought was, I know exactly who I want to record these. And it was a long distance collaboration because Wayne's home is in the Mediterranean island of Malta these days. And he lives there partly because his wife comes from Malta, partly because it has very good airline connections with just about anywhere in the world. And as an international pianist, organist, and conductor, he needs to be able to get around easily. And I have worked with him in the past. I actually met him through his sister, Melanie, who is a wonderful singer. She was a founder member of my choir, the Cambridge Singers. I was recording, and this is way back, oh my goodness me, in the 1980s, I was recording the Fauré Requiem, and one of my mezzos dropped out. And so I was one alto short. And my choir manager said, John, there's a new mezzo just come through from the Royal College of Music. Would you like to give her a try? And I said, yeah, fine. So the night before the recording, we had a rehearsal, and it came to the opening of that second movement, O Domine Jesu Christe. My goodness me, the altos are sounding good. And that was the beginning of a friendship. And Melanie brought me, this was the very early days when you could burn CDs, or maybe it was even a cassette. She said, John, take this home and play it. And it was Melanie singing some of what you could describe as the Broadway songbook, you know, Rodgers and Hart, Gershwin, and that kind of thing. And I listened to it and I said, Melanie, you know, you're great, but who is that pianist? He's terrific. And she said, that's my brother Wayne. And I said, I've got to meet him. And I did. And lo and behold, he was an equally fine organist as well as pianist. And to this day, he can play the V-dur toccata faster than any other organist on the planet. He shouldn't necessarily, but he can. And we formed a lovely working relationship. And the one and only time I took the Cambridge Singers on tour back in the 1990s, he was our accompanist for the tour. I'm very lucky to have him because we had equally to do recitals with piano accompaniment. And we were also in Washington Cathedral where he had to play the mighty organ. And gosh, he did a great job. He revealed aspects of it which normally lay hidden, I think I may say. And so we've stayed in touch ever since. And he's known, organists among you will be very well aware of this, he's known for his fantastic improvisations. And he can take any theme on earth and turn it into something you never expected. And I greatly admire that skill. I said, I know that if I ask him to record these piano transcriptions, there will be only one problem, and that will be to get him to stick to what I've written. Because I said, Wayne, you know, I know that you could improve every one of them and make them 1,000 times better and more interesting and more elaborate, but you need to stick to what's in the published score. Will you promise to do that? And he did. He actually did. He recorded in his home studio in Malta and sent me, by the miracle of the internet, sent me the recordings. I made a few comments as producer, not many, and we handed it into our record label, Decca. and they issued it. It was a very smooth and harmonious collaboration, and something that wouldn't have happened if it had not been for the pandemic. And it was what I was saying about how musicians have learned to do things they never would have otherwise. And so there he was in Malta. Here was I in Cambridge, and we worked together as if we were in the same room. And we indeed did a second volume because the reception was very kind for the first volume. So we've done two of them now. The second volume focuses mainly on Christmas music. But there you go. He's a dear colleague, and of course, as a conductor, fabulous. I mean, he actually did a second volume of recordings, not on his home studio piano, but in the conductor's suite in the Theater an der Wien, which is one of Vienna's great opera houses. And he said, after rehearsal, I'll go in and record these pieces at midnight, which is exactly what he did, because it was the only time that it was quiet. And so that was quite an achievement, because by day he was rehearsing Gershwin's great opera, Porgy and Bess, which they managed to do despite the pandemic. At the time, Austria was not very hard hit by COVID infections. Sadly, continental Europe now is having a bad time. Hopefully they're coming out of that. But this was back last September, I think. And they had a sort of little window of freedom and took good advantage of it. But there we are. I mean, I'm so happy that two albums that we never would have made in ordinary circumstances, in all likelihood, happened in these difficult conditions that we're all now hoping to emerge from, right?
Speaking of Christmas, there isn't Christmas without this book right here.
Oh!
So could you talk a little, I mean, because I know this is like the gospel and church choirs everywhere when Christmas comes. This collaboration between you and Sir David Willcocks is just timeless. Could you maybe talk about just a little bit about how this all came to be, the carols for choirs? And
Oh, well, I first encountered Sir David Willcocks when I was a member of the boy choir, taking part in the original recording of Benjamin Britten's mighty War Requiem. We were a good choir. My voice had changed by that point, and it was the choir parts for sopranos and altos. I could fake an alto just about, and my director of music at high school said, "Okay, Rutter," you know, very formal in those days, "you can come in on the recording sessions. And just don't make too much noise," you know. And of course, it gave me the opportunity to witness Benjamin Britten conducting. He was a fabulous conductor, and by his side was Sir David Willcocks, who was the director of the Bach Choir, which is a large chorus, 200 voices in London, and they were the main chorus for the War Requiem recording. And I knew that he was also the director of King's College Choir in Cambridge, of world renown. And I remember my director of music, my high school director, who was up there in the balcony where we were singing, and he pointed to Sir David and said, "I think you should get to know him. Why don't you study music at Cambridge?" Because Sir David, of course, was not only director of music, but he was one of the faculty members. And indeed, I did come to Cambridge to study for a music degree, and I was assigned to his harmony and counterpoint class. And we all wore gowns, our academic gowns, to our classes in those days. And we carried our manuscript paper under our arms, and we stood up when Sir David walked into the room. And it was all, it's like from a past century. Well, it is from a past century, the 20th century. And one day at the end of the class, he took me aside and said, "Mr. Rutter," he said, "I understand you've been composing." And I said, "Well, yes, I do, I do compose. He said, would you come to my rooms at 9 o'clock on Monday morning and bring me some of your work? And that was an order, not a suggestion. And so I did indeed go along to his rooms with some of my little pieces on Monday the following week, among which was the Shepherd's Pipe Carol, which I had written for a concert in my own college where I was conducting. It happened to be in December. So I thought, well, let's have some carols, a seasonal touch. And anyway, Sir David looked at the manuscripts and he said, would you be interested in these being published? Because he was one of the editors for Oxford University Press. He was responsible for choosing the choral music in their catalogue. And he had, of course, done and was already very famous for Carols for Choirs 1, the first volume of that series, the Green Book. And it was time, when I met him in 1966, I think it was getting to be time for a second volume. And I stayed on at Cambridge doing postgraduate work. And while I was doing that, I happened to bump into him walking down the street. And he said, oh, Mr. Rutter, he said, yes, well, I'm looking for a co-editor for a second volume of Carols for Choirs. Would you be interested? And I thought, would I be interested? Oh, my goodness me, what an honor. And he had run this idea past the senior editor at Oxford University Press, a dear man called Christopher Morris, who said, well, okay, he's young, but yeah, why not? And so I was invited to be the co-editor for the second volume, the Orange Book, because in the 10 years that had elapsed before since the first volume, his co-editor had died, Reginald Jakes. And so he was looking for somebody to share the load with. And we worked together on that volume. And we then went on to a third volume, Carols for Choirs 3, Carols for Choirs 4, which was for sopranos and altos. And then finally, a few years later, 100 Carols for Choirs, which sort of summed it up. It was kind of the best of the earlier volumes, or at any rate, the items that were most wanted. And I still look back on those evening sessions where we went through piles of manuscripts together. And I'll just detain your friends here with a little story, because I met David Willcocks, right, at the War Requiem sessions, but I had already before then submitted a little carol for a competition that the Bach Choir were doing, where it was write a carol for the Bach Choir and we'll perform it if you win. And I was still at high school. I think I was 16, maybe turning 17. It's a little piece called the Nativity Carol. And the idea was that the audience should be able to join in. It was for the Bach Choir's carol concert in the Royal Albert Hall. Well, I didn't help myself by having a descant that went up to a top A, and what would have been an audience part, not far short of it, going up to a top F sharp. So it will come as no surprise to you that it didn't win. Anyway, fast forward to when Sir David and I were working on Carols for Choirs 2, looking through a stack of manuscripts, and we came to the Nativity Carol, which our publisher had put in for consideration. And he said, oh, you know, John, the Nativity Carol. By then, it was actually in print. Oxford University Press had published it, just a little 4-page octavo. And I say it as shouldn't. Patrick, it had done rather well commercially. And so David knew that, and he looked at the piece and, oh, John, we must have it in the book. And I plucked up my courage and I said, well, David, I turned this in for a competition you judged maybe 8 years ago, and it didn't win. So you can't have liked it. It didn't even get highly commended, nothing, just returned. And he looked at it and he smiled and he said, I think it's improved remarkably since then, John. And so it did go into the second volume of Carols for Choirs, a happy association. So David is remembered for all that he did, somewhat in the way perhaps that figures like Robert Shaw and Howard Swan did in the United States, for making choirs everywhere raise their game. You know, of just saying, folks, you need to climb higher up the mountain, because that's where choirs should be. And to tell the truth, I play old choral recordings from the 1950s or earlier, and they have their qualities, but they don't really stand up by the standards we now expect. And David was unquestionably one of the leaders in Britain and beyond in encouraging choirs to just aim higher and do better. He was a humble man, but he had a vision of choral excellence, which was a vision of perfection, which by definition you can't reach on this earth. But he was telling us what to aim for, in a sense. And I was very much enriched in my early years to have had his support and to have had him as a mentor, and somebody who continued to champion my work and to be a personal friend to me until his death at the age of, I think he was 95, when he finally passed on. We all miss him. I owe him a huge debt, and I'm very, very proud and happy that our names are there side by side on the front cover of those Carols for Choirs volumes. He was a wonderful person.
Thank you so much. I mean, your Christmas anthems, they certainly, oh my goodness. When you mentioned Nativity Carol, if my choir is listening, we did that at our last Christmas Eve service. So it really struck a heart spot for me. It's just a wonderful piece. But I must say, I love Candlelight Carol. But the next piece I'm going to name is What Sweeter Music. And I heard that that was written for a very special person as well. Can you talk about What Sweeter Music? I don't have a clip for that one, but could you maybe talk about?
Oh, What Sweeter Music? Well, maybe some of you will know it from the fact it was used in a Volvo car ad back in the 1990s, with the words conveniently somewhat blurred and the whole thing condensed to 1 minute. But that was written actually for the choir of King's College, Cambridge, which by the time I wrote it was in the very capable hands of David's successor, Sir Stephen Cleobury. And he held the post of organist and choir director at King's from 1982 until his death, which took place late in 2019. We all miss him. He was somebody who initiated an awful lot of things, but in particular, I think of the commissioning of a new Christmas carol every year, because carols, of course, they've been written since time immemorial, but why should they stop? You know, it's nice to continue with new ones. And King's College Choir, because of the platform it has with its Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols every Christmas Eve, which goes out in many countries of the world, when you write a new carol for that occasion, it's making a statement in a way. And so I knew I was writing for a terrific choir under a terrific director in a terrific building. Because King's College Chapel, if you haven't visited it, anyone, you will be amazed. It has a perfect 5-second reverb, which just transforms the sound of the music that you make in there. And I always have that acoustic somewhere. It's like a tape playing in my head. And so it was a great pleasure to write for that choir. Again, I had no idea whether it would go out any more widely than that. So imagine my astonishment when it was used in a Volvo car ad. It was with my consent. It was, I guess, fairly tastefully done. But that was certainly something I had never anticipated, and choirs have picked it up and it's been translated, like quite a bit of my stuff, into a number of languages. The words of that one are especially lovely. They're by Robert Herrick, a 17th century English poet. And it was written actually for a New Year's Day celebration in Whitehall Palace, witnessed by the King. So that was rather special. And there have been other settings of those words, but I thought, well, I'm just really drawn to them. The idea was to write something that would be heard just after the reading of the three kings visiting Christ in the stable. And so what sweeter music can we bring than a carol? You know, that's our gift. And that was really the idea behind it. And so all you have to do, organists, is reach for your C flats, because it's in the key of G flat major, which is a lovely singing key. People sometimes complain about my fondness for it, but it is actually, I think, a very voice-friendly key. And as for keyboard players complaining about it, I sometimes tell them, well, it is actually the only key in which Irving Berlin could play. And he had a special transposing keyboard made for him so that he could push it to one side or the other, and the sound would come out in whatever was the right key for the music, but all he had to do was play in G flat major. So trust me, if it was good enough for Irving Berlin, it's good enough for me.
Well said, Dr. Rutter. Dr. Rutter, I just don't want to let you go. I'm sure that everyone watching this interview have enjoyed it so much. But very quickly, I want to turn back to your Requiem, because I came across a 60 Minutes interview that you did here many years ago. And just to paraphrase, the interview, it basically was saying, well, you kind of was saying how you weren't deeply religious, but religious, but deeply spiritual. And I would say that everybody can attest that spirituality is really deeply threaded in your music. So could you maybe talk to us about the Requiem, and then I'm going to play a little bit of a snippet. What really inspires this arc, or this idea of really knowing how to have that spiritual piece in your sacred music?
Well, I think I embrace many faiths. I'm open to all faiths. And the particular tradition in which I was raised was the Church of England, Anglican, sort of semi-Protestant, semi-Catholic, an English compromise. And those immortal words of, like, the burial service, I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. Those resonate with me. I grew up with them. And the words of the Psalms, the Lord is my shepherd. And so you will find those English texts, and out of the deep have I called unto thee, O Lord, interwoven with the traditional Catholic liturgy. And I wanted each one to in some way comment on the other. It was a personal work because it was in memory of my father. And it was also inspired by the experience of working on the manuscript of the beautiful Gabriel Fauré Requiem, which I did in 1983. And I think it was when I touched that manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the great National Library of France. And after all the permissions were obtained and all the rest of it, they actually handed me the manuscript. And I saw those corners of the pages just dog-eared, where he turned them over and over. He used it in funerals at his own church of the Madeleine. So it was a practical work. And at the same time, it was a spiritual one where consolation was more important than making a big show. Just focusing on bereavement and loss and consolation, and pointing towards the light at the end of the tunnel. And that's what we're all doing in this pandemic, are we not? And so it was a kind of personal testament. Composers only usually write one Requiem, and I know I will never write another, that said what I wanted to say on the subjects of life and death and bereavement and loss and consolation. And so take it for what it is, just one humble working musician's testament. And the fact that it has been done so widely, is something that I can't explain, but I am, of course, grateful for. And if it has brought consolation to people facing dark, difficult days, then that is one of the best rewards that any composer can hope for.
Beautiful. I want to play a little excerpt from your Requiem. And this is a very touching moment in the piece. And I want to share this. I won't share the entirety, but I do want to share this. That is one of the most beautiful moments of that work, that soprano soloist. My goodness. Well, Dr. Rutter, I want to say, I just always would just want to just hold you here because this has been such a wonderful, I mean, truly wonderful conversation. First of all, I want to say thank you so much. This is a full circle moment for me singing your music and doing it at the university level and, you know, in my church choirs, and to have this space with you. I'm sure that everyone watching and listening can attest to the importance that you have played in all of our lives. So first of all, on behalf of everybody, I want to say thank you so much. It's two things I want to do just to wrap up our interview. I know that we may have some young aspiring composers and conductors listening. What advice would you give them as they pursue these areas of music?
Oh, well, for conductors, I would say try not to conduct music unless you have a vision of it. You know, a way that you think it should go, and try to learn the means of communicating that vision to your performers. And just be yourself. That's also, I'd say, a very important lesson. Any good you ever do as a conductor will only be done if you are yourself. Don't copy anyone else, no matter how admired. Just let that vision flow out of you and your musicians will pick it up. And try not to waste too much time and talk too much. And so for a composer, well, you know, I have said this in interviews before, but you don't choose composition as a way of life, it chooses you. And in a sense, your path will perhaps be guided. And so it's very hard. There is no accepted career pattern for composers. You don't know where your composing gift will lead you. Take every opportunity to have your music performed, perfect your skills as much as you can, and above all, learn, and listen. And you have to be hardworking. You have to be reasonably immune to criticism. You have to have some sense of self-belief. But just try to do a good job persevere, don't ever become disheartened, and remember the best piece is always the one you haven't written yet. So
Dr. Rutter, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. And before you go, to serve as our benediction for this conversation is one of your most beloved pieces, The Lord Bless You and Keep You. And before I do that, I just want to again say thank you all for supporting this interview. And I hope you'll continue to follow me, Patrick D. McCoy, on Facebook and also on YouTube at Across the Arts. Again, I am Patrick D. McCoy, and you have been watching and listening to the Maestro series on Across the Arts. Thank you all so much. Again, Dr. Rutter, thank you so much. And just as we close, I'm going to share The Lord Bless You and Keep You. Beautiful. Again, I am Patrick D. McCoy, and thank you all so much for joining us for this special conversation with world-renowned composer and conductor, Dr. John Rutter. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm sure that everyone who has tuned in has enjoyed the knowledge about you, yourself, and your musical experience. Again, I am Patrick D. McCoy, and this has been Across the Arts. Thank you so much.